So, for today's lesson, what I wanted to talk about was a really important topic that we've touched on a little bit in other sessions before, which is marketing ethics. Um, we as marketers and business people in general have an obligation to sort of understand how what we are doing impacts people, and make sure that we are not doing something that is manipulative or taking advantage of people, especially when we are talking about, getting people to trade their money for something. So we want to make sure that the thing that we're asking them to trade their money for is real, is actually delivers on the value that that we claim it does. That we are truthful. All those kinds of things are really important, and that we aren't causing people to either unnecessary harm or to harm themselves or something like that. So we have this obligation as business people, as marketers, to ensure that our marketing is not just effective, not just able to drive the business, but also able to do that in a way that is supportive and appropriate for you know the people that our business is interacting with. So I'll start with number one, which on the diagram on the left there, which is empathy. We need to have a deep understanding of customers and consumers' needs. And we've talked a lot about that from a positioning perspective, a strategy perspective, an advertising perspective, but really understanding who they are, what's important to them, and try to really understand those needs and solve and seek to solve those needs in a way that is productive and helpful to them. The second piece, of course, is honesty. We can't manipulate or exaggerate in promotion. There are often laws that don't allow companies to make claims like my product, I don't know, cures a disease if it doesn't cure a disease. You can't just say things like that. You have to have either scientific proof, for example, in that example, or you need to say something that is more appropriate, or that you can stand by, and that doesn't manipulate customers into believing that your product does something that it doesn't do. I'll use an example. When I worked in the Planters nut business, you can't just say that, for example, almonds are heart healthy unless you have demonstrated proof that people who eat almonds a certain amount or whatever demonstrate whatever, either whatever it is, lower cholesterol or better heart health or whatever. You'd have to have proof in order to make that claim. So you can't just claim things. Now, there are claims that you can make that are, like, that are sometimes referred to legally as puffery. This is like, if you say this is the an amazing experience or something like that, you can say that because that's just puffery. You're not really making a claim. You're just, people recognize that as marketing. But if you say something is true, like, a state of fact, like my product helps with your heart health, or something like that, you have to be able to back that up, or you can't say it. You often see lawsuits, for example, where a product gets sued because, for example, the picture of the product on the package is misleading. Either that it makes the product look too large, or the Hershey company sometimes faces lawsuits because on their Reese's Halloween pumpkin candy, they sometimes show that the pumpkins have eyes on the package, and they don't actually have eyes, or that the shape of their Christmas tree shaped Reese's is supposed to look like a tree, and somebody sued them because it didn't really look like a tree. Now, do I think that's a useful, lawsuit and, kind of a little ridiculous? Yes. But the reality is, if you aren't careful, if you say things that are not true, if you try and imply that something is bigger than it is, or that you're going to get more than you get, or whatever it is, those kinds of negative sort of predatory practices, manipulative practices are dishonest, often illegal, and certainly unethical. Um, Transparency, openness about business operations used in marketing. So this can be a number of things. One of them is, are you doing things from a marketing perspective that are, transparent? Like, hey, there are laws that say you can't just send people emails without getting their consent. You can't pretend that you have their consent and so forth. That's not to say that companies don't do it all the time. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I get emails all the time from companies that I did not sign up for. Technically, they are not supposed to do that. And, there are fines for doing it. The reality is they don't often get enforced. But you have to be careful to, be transparent about when you are marketing to people, what you are doing, how you're doing it, and so forth. But the other piece about transparency is how, for example, about how your product is made. The Hershey company and other chocolate manufacturers have gotten into a lot of hot water with certain groups because cacao, which is the sort of the plant from which chocolate comes from, it grows in generally in sort of tropical areas in Africa, Indonesia, etc. And in many of these places, the labor practices are unacceptable. Sometimes using children. Sort of indentured or slave labor, and so forth. And all of those things are obviously unethical. It is very difficult to, for a company like the Hershey company and Mars company, which makes M&Ms and so forth, to overcome these issues because the industry and the agriculture is, these bad practices are so pervasive. But if a company is discovered to be sort of leveraging bad practices, you've probably heard about Apple using, child labor in Asia, or other companies getting in trouble, clothing manufacturers getting in trouble for using, essentially slave labor, or locking people into factories and creating terrible work conditions, etc. So if you are not acting in an ethical way, and you are not transparent about it, it can cause major damage to your reputation. And people may decide to not work with you. There may be legal ramifications, or there may just be sort of backlash. Walmart and Amazon often face backlash for their labor practices in the United States and how they treat their workers. Those kinds of things can make it harder to hire people, and can also lead to some consumers not being willing to, shop or buy those products at those stores, or be customers or consumers of a certain brand or company. Promise keeping is an interesting one and very challenging. If you make a promise as a brand, you really should keep it, and that you have a genuine intention to fill the promise that you've given to customers and society is important. When I was at Cracker Barrel, there was I think it was PETA, is often after restaurant companies, especially companies like Cracker Barrel, to use cage-free chickens, and cage-free eggs, because they, those practices are viewed, at least by PETA, as sort of unacceptable ways of an inhumane treatment of animals. So at some point, probably about 10 years ago, Cracker Barrel made a public statement, a promise, if you will, that they were going to move to cage-free eggs in the next 10 years. And they really hadn't moved very far in that and made much progress on that in, intervening, I don't know, say 7 years when I was there, in part because it's very hard to do. It's hard to shift the whole egg production industry to, cage-free when the whole industry is built around, egg, cage, birds in cages, essentially. And so unfortunately, what this meant for Cracker Barrel was they had made a promise that they couldn't keep. I'm not saying that they weren't necessarily being malicious. They weren't being intentional in not delivering on that promise. They ideally would deliver on that promise. The issue was that they had made the promise and they couldn't keep it, and that's in some ways worse than not making the promise at all, which, is painful in the moment, right? Because you've got, say PETA or whatever saying we're going to protest you and we're going to boycott you and so forth. But if you make a promise, you really need to keep it. It often looks worse when you make a promise that makes people feel good and then you don't deliver on it, even if it's years later. Now, it's an interesting challenge, right? Because in this particular case, most of the public didn't care about this topic of cage-free eggs, and so to some extent, companies sometimes get away with this, not keeping their promises because the public opinion in general doesn't really care about it. But I would say if that's the case, then you'd actually be better off not making the promise in the first place. That would be the more ethical thing to do rather than making a promise and then failing to keep it. And then the last piece is sustainability. This is commitment to the public, to the environment, and social well-being, right? You see this a lot in some of these social media platforms. You hear a lot about these social media platforms impacting kids' mental health, the bullying, this all these sort of issues, and they just sort of sweep it under the rug and don't really deal with these problems, which are ultimately really problems of sustainability. Like, can we continue to have these, say, terrible, things happening where people are, being cyberbullied and, and harming themselves and so forth? Are we okay with, companies doing that for over the long haul? Or cigarettes as a great example of this. The cigarette companies for years and years denied and tried to hide the fact that their product was causing lung cancer and all kinds of other diseases, emphysema, etc. And they were trying to hide that because they were trying to do business. And that is not really a commitment to, again, the public, the environment, social well-being. You see a lot of companies that, are not willing to, oil companies, et cetera, who are, often, I don't know if you've ever noticed, but sometimes oil companies are, have a solar power, sort of arm of their company. Why do they do that? Well, it's because not so much because they want to shift people to solar power because they are oil companies, but it is a way to create this sense that, oh, look, we're being green, we're trying to do this, the right thing, when in fact what they're doing is just trying to create PR and buzz that sort of gets them off the hook. And so the question is that ethical, right? It's not a sustainable practice. It is trying to manipulate the public and so forth. So not sustainable, not supportive of, again, public, the environment, and social well-being in general. So as marketers, I think we really have a obligation and should commit to being ethical and doing all these things, being, having empathy for the customer, not just trying to take their money, being honest about what our product does, not confusing or manipulating people, being transparent about how we conduct our business and making sure that we are conducting our business in ways that are ethical, keeping our promises, not saying we're going to do something and then not doing it, and then focusing on sustainability and making sure that we are supporting the consumers and the environments and the societies that we are, as marketers, that we are part of. So just the note on the right there, because marketing involves persuading and convincing people to exchange money for value, it is really essential to consider all the ways in which that relationship can be abused and avoid those. I wanted to share just a story from my own career. So a couple years ago, there was a big, sort of PR disaster, if you will, for Bud Light, where Bud Light had created a promotion or a TikTok, I think it was a TikTok or just an influencer promotion where they had different influencers and they would send them Bud Light Bud Light cans with the influencers name on them, and they sent these to many people, of from all different sort of walks of life, different lifestyles, etc. Um, when they did this, one of the things that they did was they sent the this they did this one of the influencers that they reached out to was a trans woman named Dylan Mulvaney. Um, and some various folks like Kid Rock and so forth got a hold of the fact that they were working with this trans woman and turned this into a huge, like, oh, Bud Light is gone woke, etc. And it created this huge backlash against Bud Light. And so the result of this was that Bud Light was starting to see sales drop or whatever. And I guess what I will say is, if I'm being kind about it, what happened was they panicked. And when they panicked, they basically issued an apology, said we shouldn't have worked with Dylan Mulvaney. They said they sent their CEO out on an apology tour to all the news outlets and whatever. And this actually created an even worse PR disaster for them, because essentially, Dylan Mulvaney was receiving a lot of negative and threatening comments online and whatever. And Bud Light, who hired her to do this, basically did not protect her, did not stand up for her, walked away from her, didn't stand up for the for trans people and trans rights in the society. And the result of this was that they not only angered the people who were against them doing this promotion, but now they also angered all the people that were supporters of trans rights and LGBTQ rights and whatever. And so now what ends up happening is they've basically made everyone angry. This led to even larger drops in their reputation scores, in their sales, I believe dropped in the order of like 20+%. And really, they really haven't been able to recover over time from this. Now, some people would say, "Oh, this is because they did something that they shouldn't have done. They should have understood their consumers better and not done this promotion with Dylan Mulvaney." And I say that's ridiculous, because they sent out Bud Light cans to, I don't know how many people, but let's say dozens of people were part of this promotion. Dylan Mulvaney was just one of them, and their whole point was, everybody likes Bud Light. And so what they should have done was they should have stated their values, and this is sort of the core of all PR and crisis PR, is you state your values. We support everyone. Our product is for everyone ever. And then you stick with your guns. You do not walk away. You do not backtrack. You do not cave because public opinion is mad at you or whatever. And the result, when you don't cave and you support people and you act ethically in these situations, is that people may be annoyed with you for a while, but they essentially drop it eventually and forget it. Instead, what Bud Light did was they backtracked, they reversed course, and the other thing they kept doing that is a total PR disaster is they kept talking about it. I like to say the media is always looking for a brawl, right? They are looking for a fight. They want companies to do something that create, when a company gets called out like this, whatever, what they want is the company to react, because that gives them another story. And then the counter reaction gives them another story and another story and another story. And that's exactly what Bud Light did. The story came out, and then they reacted to the story, and that became a story, and then the reaction to the reaction became a story, and so forth. And they just kept escalating this story. And then they sent their CEO out on an apology tour, and every time the CEO went on Today's Show or whatever it was, it just made the situation worse. And so this is what I believe really happened to Bud Light, was they didn't they didn't have a clear understanding of their values. The moment their action didn't fit with their profits or whatever, they backtracked, gave up and whatever, and demonstrated to the world that they had no values. And that is why I believe that that Bud Light really suffered during this PR crisis. The flip side of this was at the exact same moment, Cracker Barrel, it was around June, and so for Pride Month, for about the third year in the row, Cracker Barrel posted, I think it was on Facebook, the post that you see on the right, which was a picture of rainbow colored rocking chairs, and said we value what everyone brings to the table, and was sort of in support of Pride Month. The result of this saying that they were supportive of Pride Month in the middle of this Dylan Mulvaney crisis for Bud Light led to a bunch of articles, angry commentary, whatever, saying, "Oh, Cracker Barrel has gone woke." I remember there's one article called "Cracker Barrel has fallen." Cracker Barrel is sort of again caving to the to whatever, I don't know, liberal ideas, whatever it was, all the terrible stuff that people said. And Cracker Barrel reacted to it completely differently, because Cracker Barrel basically said, our crisis team, of which I was a part, we basically said, we have stated our values. Our values are that we welcome everyone to the table. Doesn't matter who they are. And so that's our values. And so these articles came out and said, "Oh, Cracker Barrel has fallen," or "Cracker Barrel is woke," or whatever. And our reaction to it was to stop talking, because our view was, we have already stated our values. We welcome everyone to the table. We don't have to say anything more. And anything more we say is that brawl that the media is looking for. They are looking for us to react so that they can continue and build and augment this story. And so the result of this was that, yes, there were a couple articles about this, this post and whatever, but the reality was it just died off in a couple days, because we didn't feed the fire. We didn't send our CEO out on an apology tour. We didn't say, "Oh my gosh, we're so sorry that we, offended, people," whatever it is, because we didn't offend. I mean, people may have been offended, but we did not offend people. Our values were, we welcome everyone to the table. We value what everyone brings to the table, and we stuck with those. And so it's sort of a cautionary tale on the Bud Light side, and a great example of what you can do in a crisis like this on the Cracker Barrel side is you state your values. You demonstrate that you have values, that you are acting ethically, that you are supportive of society and all the people in it, and then you shut up and let the media say what they're going to say. Don't react, don't get angry, don't respond, and the story will go away, because you've already stated your values. Now, there are times, and this happened at Cracker Barrel, where something bad would happen that was our fault. So in that case, it's a little bit different. If you did something wrong, you make a statement, state your values, apologize, and say, this doesn't fit with the values that we have. And then you shut up, stop talking about it, because the more you talk about it, the more you create a story. And so this is, probably the most important thing one can learn about PR. And it is really based foundationally in this idea of marketing ethics, which is, you have to understand your company's values, and you have to demonstrate that you are living those values. And consumers may be mad at you, and some of them may boycott you and leave and whatever. But for the most part, if you just stick with your guns and say, these are my values, people will respect that, and they will not. And nothing really bad will happen. And it was interesting, because I had data, third-party syndicated data at the time, where I was able to see the reputation impact of the Bud Light controversy on Bud Light, and this impact of this, post and the quote unquote controversy, if you will, on Cracker Barrel, because in theory they were happening at the same time. You could look at them and say, what's happening. And what was interesting was the net reputation score, meaning the positives minus the negatives, for Bud Light dropped 30 points. That is a massive drop. Very unusual to see that kind of change in a in a brand reputation. Whereas Cracker Barrel's reputation at the same time, it was a blip. You could barely even see, there was like maybe a momentary drop of like some fraction of a point, and then it went right back to where it was pretty quickly after that. So it really sort of speaks to this point of, from a reputation perspective, the damage that was done from Bud Light perspective was probably less about the promotion itself and this sponsorship or whatever itself, and much more about the fact that they demonstrated that their values were based on nothing, right? Their values were money. And so, that sort of lack of values, that lack of ethics in this situation, that lack of supporting somebody was actually, I think, even with the people that disagreed with Bud Light's promotion, was probably more damaging than the sponsorship itself. So ethics goes beyond telling the truth and not manipulating people. Brands need to stand for their values, and when they waver, public perception can shift on them very, very quickly.